Hello everybody, my name is Andy Garcia and today I'll be talking to you guys about the biometric identification desktop version of the application. So for this project we had divided up into two. My partner Frederick Hudson did the mobile application and I did the desktop version. Here we're going to talk about some sequence diagrams and some class diagrams real quick before we jump into the actual running of the code. So in this sequence diagram, as you can see, we have the user logs in with an email and password, and we make a socket connection for that user, and we return the socket ID associated with that user. Once we have authenticated their email and password, we also return a user ID, right, that's generated by our Firebase database right here. And that user ID is then used to create a socket room that will privately contain only the desktop and mobile application of that user. So we can make a connection between the two. That way we can send confirmation from us to the mobile application and vice versa. As you can see on this side, we send an authentication request for the user to take a picture to authenticate themselves. And then the authentication request sends a response. This entire portion right here is the mobile application side, and that will be explained by my partner in a future video. Once we receive the authentication response back through the user ID, which again is by the private socket room, we will then check the authentication. If it passed or failed, we will allow the user into the enterprise app or not. Here we have the class diagram representation for the desktop application. As you can see, we have our main function, our main class, the app.js. We're using React Native to build this, and we're also using Electron, by the way, for the desktop to make it a desktop application. So here we have home, which is our main page, the navigation bar, and the layout.js, which is essentially for some bootstrapping. And home connects to our login page, and login connects to our authentication, which also connects to our server. Now the login page, right, you have where the user can put their email and passwords in, but most of the logic is connected to the authentication.js, right? This is where the user can sign out, sign in, and also when the user status change, the application will do a particular function. For example, when the user logs in, we would take the user ID, right? And we would create a socket room by talking to the server. The server was built using socket.io, and we will go more into detail about that once we start talking about the actual code. Okay, so before we get too deep into the actual running of the application, let's talk a little bit about the package.json, which is what all of you guys will have to look for before actually running the application. Here you will see all the dependencies that we have, as well as the versions that we use, right? As well as the latest version that you can use. My IDE is Visual Studio Code. And at the bottom, you will also see all the scripts that you can run, right? So essentially our main two focuses is server and start. If you see over here, before you run the actual application itself, you have to do npm install, right? This will install every dependency in your package.json, and if you want to add any other dependencies to this package.json, you add it, and then you run npm install again to make sure it's in your system. And this is the same for anybody else who wants to run this desktop version of the application. Now, if you run npm run server, you will see here that we are just running the socket server associated with the application. All of that code is stored in the server.js file. And as you can see, we make an HTTP socket server, create the socket connection, and then once the desktop or mobile application have successfully connected, right? So once the socket server hears about an emitted connection, we would then create a socket.id. The ID would be returned to the user. And if they disconnect, we will also take away that socket.id. As you can see here, if the user ends up creating once we return the user ID back from the Firebase database, we will create a room for the user using that user ID. Once we want to authenticate from the desktop application to the mobile side, we are waiting for an authentication connection. And then once we disconnect, we're also removing the user from that room permanently. And here on the socket.on, we also are waiting for a result, right? So this is from the mobile application to the desktop application side, where it waits for a result. And depending on the result, we either pass the user to the enterprise app or don't let them go to the enterprise app. Next, we're going to run the Npm Run Start, which is actually running both the server as well as our desktop application. Now we're going to be talking about actually running the desktop and server side together. Here you will see us run Npm Run Start. And this will start up our server, our socket server that I talked about before. It will also start up our actual desktop application. You'll also see some connections using the socket.id and things of the sort. Now, we're not actually showing you the whole roundabout of the application because that would take for the mobile application to also be connected. We're just giving you essentially how it will work in a theoretical sense. So here we have the server which successfully started. We're working with port 8000. Mind you, if you have anything else running on port 8000, please be mindful and change it or change the server itself. And here we have the React.js and Electron working together so that we can create this desktop application version. As you can see, it's still very bare bones in terms of the actual UI. This is version 1, so we were focused on getting all the core functionality working. The user can log in over here, and if you can open the developer tools, you can see that the user is not currently logged in. So if I do me@example.com and then I run the password, you can see that now I've successfully logged a user in. And this here is its associated user ID, which we are using down here, as you can see, to create a socket.id. Now, every time you move to a different page in your web app in your application, right? You're going to disconnect from the socket server and reconnect. That's what happened here. We were at the home page at some point. We disconnected to move to the login page, and then we reconnected again. And as you can see, once we logged in, we had the user, that same connection that we had before, connect again using the user ID. Now, when you see the mobile application also log in, right, successfully, they will also be added to the exact same room because they share the exact same user ID from Firebase. And then you will see something prompt up on the desktop application similar to this that says, oh, we have 2 sockets in this room. And then they've established a communication between each other. This is essentially how the desktop application works. Again, as a quick recap, to download all your your dependencies from package.json, you need to do npm install. To run just the server side, npm run server. To run both the server and the desktop application, you need to do npm run start. Now, real quick, we're going to talk about one last thing we need to do in order to successfully make a connection between our desktop application and our iOS application. So here we have an application called ngrok. This essentially allows us to tunnel our localhost connection into a system that's outside of your local network. Now, the reason we're using this is because iOS requires that we have an HTTPS connection that's licensed and certified by Apple. For that, you need to be an Apple developer, of which we are not, and it costs some sort of money. So if your product owner wants to do that for you, if the company that sponsors you wants to do that, that's great. Then we can establish a socket server connection that's secure. But until we get that done, you need to run it through ngrok because ngrok tunnels your local connection by using ngrok HTTP and the port that you have, that you're using the socket server, and creating a HTTPS version of that local connection. That way, the iOS application won't complain that the connection it's connecting to isn't secure. Now, this has to be changed roughly every 7 hours or whenever you run the application so that you make sure that it connects successfully from the iOS version to the desktop version. And this rounds up all the things you need to do to run this application correctly. If you have any more questions, please look at the documentation, that the final deliverable that we will be leaving in the zip file. And thank you very much.